Wouldn't you love to see one of these NFL owners, when somebody disrespects our flag, to say, get that son of a bitch off the field right now, out, he's fired. He's fired!
Donald Trump has stoked the flames of racial animus since the earliest days of his campaign, again and again and again, in his crusade against players kneeling during the national anthem to protest social injustice effectively turned professional football into another front in his larger culture war. The NFL has announced a major new partnership with Jay-Z, whereby the rap legend and media mogul would oversee music, entertainment, and social justice issues for the league. But there's some controversy. Jay-Z facing criticism for partnering with the institution that effectively kicked Colin Kaepernick out of the league for protesting during the national anthem. Let's bring into our conversation NFL Hall of Fame quarterback Warren Moon. Warren, thank you for coming back to the show, and give us your thoughts about the partnership and the pros and cons for both sides.
Well, yeah, this has received a lot of controversy, but I think in any situation where you're trying to make change, anything is good. And I think the relationship can be a very, very good relationship for the NFL and for Roc Nation, only because Jay-Z is a guy who comes from the streets. So he understands what some of these initiatives are all about and some of the social injustice that's been going on in these communities for many years. And he has a voice to those communities. And he also has other initiatives around the country in other different neighborhoods. So he's a guy that I think that can relate to both sides. I think he's a guy through his music and through his representation of all the players and entertainment artists that he represents can get that message across to the NFL and to other people in higher positions that more needs to be done. This isn't a problem that's going to be solved by the NFL by itself, but I think what the NFL owners did last year was they donated $90 million over 6 years to their Players Initiative Fund, and a lot of those programs are starting to be initiated throughout the country. I don't think a lot of people know about that, and now they're starting to take it a step further with this association with Jay-Z and Roc Nation. So I think things are being done in the right direction to try and help some of the social injustice that's being done in these communities, but it's not going to be done only by the NFL. It's going to take a lot of different entities to get that done. And then when it comes to Colin Kaepernick, he's a guy that's been away from the league now for 3 years. And I think there were teams that have offered him an opportunity to play, but they also wanted him to give them the word that he was going to stop his kneeling. And when it comes to kneeling and protesting, the reason you protest is to make change and try and get people to make change. Well, I think that change is starting to happen, so there really isn't a need for the kneeling to happen when you start to get people to make positive change for what you were protesting in the first place is.
But Warren, can you see how some supporters of Kaepernick might see him as having been left behind? You've got these two giants, these two titans, Jay-Z and the NFL, which might be the only entity with more money than Jay-Z, teaming up, and you've still got Kaepernick literally and figuratively on the sidelines.
Yeah, I understand that, but like I said, a lot of teams are not going to go out on a limb and bring in a guy who they feel like is going to be a distraction to their football team and to their organization. And I think Colin has been offered some opportunities to play football, but they wanted him to guarantee that he wasn't going to become a distraction by continuing to kneel and continuing to keep this negative light on the NFL. So I think that's one of the reasons why he has still not been able to get a job in the National Football League.
Where I take issue is that I don't think what Colin Kaepernick did and continues to represent is to put a bad light on the NFL, is to put the light on some things that were being ignored in this country, like police brutality and other issues. This morning, I preached the funeral of Eric Garner's stepfather, who just died. And many of the mothers of the movement was there, and we're going to meet and talk on this issue. So I respect Jay-Z, and Jay-Z has a record of working with the mothers and working with many of these situations. But the NFL should not be able to duck the fact that they were actively involved in not letting Colin Kaepernick make this protest on behalf of people in his community, and nothing will, I don't care if they did 90 million with the players or 9 zillion with somebody else, they've got to deal with what happened with Colin Kaepernick. He was protesting for real change about the criminal justice system, not about players and scholarships. I think Jay-Z is one that will shoot straight. He has a track record. I'm not prepared to say whatever we're going to say collectively, but I do not want to see anybody have a discussion with Colin Kaepernick. He's not given credit for doing what a lot of people wouldn't do.
Well, let me just follow up with you, Rev. I mean, it would seem that the NBA and even women's soccer seems to absorb with more comfort their players' right to protest than the NFL. What is the structural problem of the NFL with protest?
That's the big question. You just had at the Pan Am Games a guy take a knee.
Yeah.
So how can everybody understand people's right to make a statement but the NFL? I mean, we just got through talking about Hong Kong. You can go and protest for democracy there, and we're saying, wait a minute, be careful, but you can't play ball if you take a knee. A knee. We're not talking about he disrupted the game, he didn't do it in the middle of the game. A knee during the national anthem to say there's some wrong going on. He should not be left out. At the same time, if the players are doing constructive things, and Jay-Z, who I've not talked about, his program is constructive, that's fine. But let's not punish the one that gave some real support and comfort to these families that were hurting. Because I know I've been with them families and still am.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.